This episode here is really all just an introduction to networking for those of you who really haven't come across this before. So this is introductory stuff. If you want to go deeper into infrastructure and networking terminology, well, there are more modules in other parts of the masterclasses that will address those. Go and look those up. But this is for the beginners, and it is absolutely essential to understand before you move on anyway. So, networking, small pieces of hardware, big pieces of hardware, how they all link together, and what sort of devices are brought into play here. This is what this particular episode is all about. It's vital for you to understand how large IT departments work in terms of their hardware setup. Now, as always, it is worth going back to the beginning chapters of IT. The reason we're doing this here is, again, not just nice to know, is because we now realize that in a networking concept, the IT people have now come to understand those people back in the day actually got many things right. And we may be veered off course a bit in our networking trajectory. So in those, if you remember, back in those 1960s and 1970s, it was all about those large machines. There were no PCs. Just to bring this into play here, the PC officially came in 1981, and it was the official IBM machine. So there were other desktop machines at the time, but IBM coined the term personal computer in 1981, and they were effectively the first people to commercially launch that sort of machine. Prior to that, no one had a PC. So how the hell did they work? Well, the setup was completely different back in those days. In those days, as I alluded to earlier, there was this huge machine sitting at the center of your organization, the heart of your organization, and this machine was a mainframe. It served everyone within that organization. Now, by the way, I keep using the term mainframe. Some people in IT still snigger a bit when you use the term mainframe rather than server. But to be honest, IBM, HP in their literature still refer to these large machines as mainframes. So it is a designated type of hardware, and that's what you need to understand, that the generic name for those large machines is mainframe. Larger than that are supercomputers. So these mainframes were there in those early days, and they were duty bound to serve a whole host of users, entire armies of users. Now, the interesting thing is that if your parents or your grandparents worked in any way in anything to do with IT, on their desk was a device. There wasn't a PC, but it did look a bit like a PC. If you look at this, it had a keyboard, it had a screen, actually pretty much an electronic typewriter, essentially, but it was an IT piece of kit, because this was a device that was physically linked to the mainframe down there in the basement. And this, in chapter 1, very important for you to understand, out of interest, but also from a significant conceptual perspective, this device was called a dumb terminal. Now, there are people still within IT who will have had experiences of dumb terminals back in the day. Now, it was called dumb. Dumb as in Dumber and Dumber. It was called dumb for a reason. And that's because these things, if you pulled the network out from the back, they did nothing on their own. They had a screen, they had a keyboard, and that's kind of where it stopped. So if you look closely, this thing has no CD-ROM. Of course, CDs didn't exist back in the day, but they didn't even have floppy drives in these machines. Floppy drives are something that you need to ask your parents about. Don't worry about it. They didn't even have a hard drive. So these machines didn't have a floppy drive. They didn't have a hard drive. No CD-ROM. So effectively, all these were a window into the mind of the mainframe. You opened these up and you could peer inside the mainframe, and that was it. So IT people back in the day were people who looked after mainframes linked to dumb terminals. And that's important for you to understand, really, as a modern concept, which I'll come back to. But in order to fully understand things that you see on your CVs, including cloud technology, you need to kind of get really familiar with this concept here. So if you were a user back in the day, in the 70s, on the trade floor of whichever organization had one of these things, in those days, you were primarily a data entry clerk. So that's your job. You spent 8 hours a day putting all your information into one of these machines. And then eventually you would press save. Ooh, but this thing didn't have a hard drive. So what happened when you press save? Something profound happened when you press save back in the 60s and 70s. We must understand this. When you press save back in the day, it didn't get saved onto this machine. It actually got saved onto the mainframe. We didn't really understand how brilliant a concept that was going to be until later on, until today actually. But in those days, these things were called dumb terminals. We put all our information in here, we pressed save, and it went to the mainframe. Everything was saved there. Oh, by the way, guess where the applications were in those days? On the mainframe. Guess where the operating system was? On the mainframe. Oh, so in chapter 1, our entire IT three-layer model existed on the mainframe. Now, remember, there was also no beautiful mouse here. So the GUI wasn't invented until 1984, effectively. And so this was green on green. There was no beautiful mouse and clever interaction with icons. You were typing stuff in and you were using a keyboard to input commands. This was a horrible time for users. But if you ask IT even today, they will tell you that this was one of the best chapters in IT, because this architecture here had immense benefits. I don't know if you've clicked with this yet, but think about it for a second. If you're someone running a large organization that has one of these mainframes and the users are all using dumb terminals, well, there are certain things that are very reassuring with this. Firstly, this is a centralized architecture. That's effectively what it's known as. This type of network is called a centralized architecture. It's one where everything is happening in one place. Well, that has huge benefits. The benefits are, firstly, everything is in one place, so if anything goes wrong, you only need to go to that one place. Think about it. Excellent security, because the users can never get into the system. There was no floppy drive, there was no hard drive, so you couldn't physically enter anything into the system. That's really cool, which means you couldn't enter viruses, you couldn't enter your own applications. And of course, the reverse of that is also you couldn't take anything out of this system either. So hold on, this chapter 1 in IT, in networking, is a really cool concept where you've got everything in one place, the IT department is in control, and users really do what they're told to do. You can't steal data. You can't input bad data or viruses. So what a beautiful system for large companies. If you had data, it was pretty secure, and if things were going to go wrong, they were only going to go wrong in one place. So guess what? How big do you think your IT department was back in the day? Well, in this era here, the IT department really just consisted of 2 people wearing white coats, and they just looked after the mainframe all day long. They never needed to come out onto the trade floor because, of course, nothing went wrong on the user's devices at in the trade floor. If the dumb terminals ever failed, well, we would just take them away and put a new dumb terminal in place, and voila, you're up and running again. So if there was data corruption, you only needed to look in one place. If you needed to get a new application to be installed for everyone, you only needed to go into one place. Wow. tiny IT department. Users couldn't steal data. There was no corruption of data coming in the other way. This was a very nice setup. A simple IT architecture that worked for everyone. That's how it was for a couple of decades. And then something extraordinary happened.